Sherwood Dungeon is an MMORPG game that is still around to this day. It's one of the oldest ones that was released back in 2004, and at its peak it was pulling in millions of players a month and winning actual best game awards. Yeah, these graphics, these were considered award-winning back in the day. That's how long it's been. But for as popular as the game was back then, it's one of the few MMORPGs that's still around, but unfortunately got left behind with the times and stayed in the 2000s era. People kept playing RuneScape and World of Warcraft, which are both from the same era, and are still wildly successful and continue growing to this day. But why did players move on from Sherwood Dungeon? What caused this game to just be left in the dust? Well, honestly, once you know the reasons, it kind of makes sense why this game was abandoned. But first, let's talk about what made Sherwood Dungeon so popular in the first place. Like, what was the main selling point that had so many people playing this game non-stop? So Sherwood released in 2004 on the website MaidMarian.com, originally as a browser game because browser games just happened to be all the rage back then, and this little feature of it being a browser game just so happens to be what helped Sherwood skyrocket in popularity. And the one thing that made browser games the perfect target to go viral is just how extremely accessible it is to play the game, right? Because all you have to do is go to the website, click on the game, and you're already in. Yeah, that's it. It's just that easy. And the best part, the absolute best part of it all is that if you wanted to share the game, all you had to do was copy paste the link over to your friends using MSN Messenger, and they're already in as well. So it was extremely easy to get people to play the game. So now try to visualize that ease of access with a massive multiplayer online game that was quick to start playing because you didn't have to make an account to log in, was super easy to share over word of mouth, and it was completely free to play. No paid memberships like World of Warcraft or RuneScape because Sherwood Dungeon only made money off of advertisements on the homepage. There was no membership fee whatsoever. Of course Sherwood Dungeon was going to blow up. There was no reason for it not to. As a matter of fact, it was reported that Sherwood was getting over 100,000 unique visits per day, and eventually MaidMarian released Sherwood Dungeon, which was an updated version of the game with a lot more content added to it, and that basically replaced original Sherwood, which eventually would turn into Sherwood Classic. And Sherwood Dungeon just made the game skyrocket even more in popularity. This thing just did not seem to have an end to it. As a matter of fact, back in the day, Sherwood Dungeon got so popular that people started calling it a World of Warcraft copy. People really thought that Gene Androdi, the game's creator, basically stole the game concept from Blizzard Entertainment, but in reality, Sherwood released 4 months before World of Warcraft, so who's really copying who here? Well, the straightforward answer is that nobody's copying each other. They're two completely different games, and that would ultimately play a part in Sherwood's decline in player base. So Sherwood Dungeon, because it was a web browser game, had a couple of limitations in its capabilities because while it was an almost revolutionary concept, the whole thing was revolutionary, that you had a huge 3D game running on Adobe Shockwave, it was also a pretty surface level game in terms of in-game content. Remember that most Shockwave games were kind of rough looking at the time. It was made by game developer Gene Androdi, who ran the website MaidMarian and was working on Sherwood Dungeon alongside a bunch of other games that MaidMarian was hosting on the website, and this guy was basically a solo act. Like, he just did not have anyone else to work with. So he was running a successful gaming website by himself, and I know that doesn't seem so impressive now in present day, but remember that this was 20 years ago, so back in the day, that was a feat. So getting into Sherwood Dungeon, you could customize your character to look however you wanted. Not that many customization options, but you know, you could pick through a bunch of characters, and there was a few different mobs that would spawn into the map for you to kill and level up, and as you leveled up, you unlock different power abilities that you can use to fight, and you can either loot, buy, or craft better weapons and gear, and you can either go questing, interact with players in PvP, or deep dive into the dungeon part of the game. So pretty simple objectives to say the least. The game ran with a very typical MMORPG formula, but let's talk about the glaring red flags that Sherwood Dungeon had at the time, that now with hindsight being 2020, you can look at them and go like, well, of course this game is just not gonna last. But you know, back in the day, there was absolutely no way for people to know what was about to happen. So let's talk about the Sherwood Dungeon lore. Let's take a deep dive, if you will, into the characters, the storyline, everything that made you fall in love with the game in the first place. Yeah, there was none of that. Sherwood had a very limited amount of quests, with there only really being one main quest line called the Prophecy of Bane, and it was really just a chain of defeat and collect quests. Everybody loves defeat and collect quests, and through this quest chain, you went through different worlds collecting sigils, so that way you can craft the Dragon Claw Scepter, the only weapon in this world that could be able to defeat the great and terrible dragon. And okay, yes, you can give the game points for having a storyline in the first place, but the problem is that while you were traveling through all the different worlds, yeah, you would visit them and they'd be kinda different, but it was like going through different Minecraft biomes, except all of them were empty. There was absolutely nothing to do in them other than just do that one quest that you're currently in, and a lot of it just felt like bloat landscape, where you just had the quest giver, the merchant, maybe you had 2 to 3 different mobs for you to fight, and sometimes you only did as little as one quest before you you were already teleported to a different landscape. Well, actually, that's a very accurate way to describe the Sherwood Dungeon questing and dungeon experience. A lot of bloat landscape with nothing to do other than just wander around and kind of just exist. That's it. So once you were done with the main questline that typically took you about an hour or two to beat, the only other thing to do in Sherwood Dungeon was to really just keep leveling up, visit the islands and just kind of wander around, or if you're social enough, try talking with other players and get into PvP, which PvP in Sherwood Dungeon is the most miserable experience I've ever seen in combat, honestly. Like, RuneScape PvP is already kind of funny looking. A Sherwood Dungeon PvP, that's another nightmare. But the PvP in Sherwood Dungeon was actually one of the main selling points because there were clans that would form with actual clan websites and application forms, and you would have to go to clan meetings and training, and you would have actual raids against enemy and rival clans, so it was like a big deal. And out of all the people that I've talked to this day that still remember Sherwood Dungeon fondly, they say that one of the best experiences that they had was the clan wars, you know, just being part of a clan and having that social aspect to it. And although no one really knew it back then, this was one of the biggest red flags that the game had, and one of the things that just led the game to its downfall. Meanwhile, other MMORPGs just kept getting more popular. Because you see, back in the early days of the internet, there was a wave of online games where basically their whole purpose was to just have people come in and hang out. You know, it was pretty bare bones experience that you didn't really need much to keep people entertained, and honestly that's all you needed to succeed in an online game, because the idea of having an avatar in a game and seeing other people's with their avatars in the same game where you can chat was just absolutely mind-blowing, honestly. So a lot of them really just felt like you were going into a chat room to socialize, except every chat room had a gimmick, and MaidMarian was known to take advantage of this gimmick because you had Club Marian, which was basically a chat room but in 3D, and then you also had Moonbase, which was also a chat room but in space, and then of course you had Sherwood Dungeon, which ultimately, while it wasn't technically a chat room, the main reason people went in was to have a sense of community, and people felt like they had somewhere to go to log in every day and just talk and hang out with people. So it was a lot less about keeping you engaged through a deep storyline, and it was more about who's there to chat and hang out today, who can I talk to just have fun today. And that simple style of video games eventually just became obsolete because now every game has that, except they have that plus a deep enriching story and a complete game with a lot of things to do. And as soon as the player base in Sherwood Dungeon declined and there weren't enough people running around, you could really see just how absolutely empty and just devoid of content the game really was. And ultimately, the players were never really given a reason to stick around other than the game's community, which was dwindling by the day, just as brand new games and much more complete games were being released. And the few updates that the game was receiving were coming in very slowly due to the fact that there was only one developer really working on the game, and Sherwood Dungeon, while it was completely free to play, which was a pretty big selling point at the start, it's not like they were really rolling in cash to be able to afford hiring more people to keep developing the game. And when Adobe eventually discontinued their Flash player, which is where Sherwood Dungeon was running on, Gene did make a brief update to the game to make it a standalone app on mobile so you can play it on mobile, and they also gave it a launcher on desktop, you know, while adding, you know, a couple of loot boxes here and there, you know, microtransactions. But ever since that point, Sherwood Dungeon was completely abandoned, leaving only the few remaining players that are left, usually less than 30, to be the ones that are keeping the game alive until Gene eventually just pulls the plug on the game and shuts it down for good. And as for my personal experience with the game, I discovered Sherwood when I googled medieval MMO games during a massive burnout I was feeling because I was playing RuneScape just way too much. And you know, I had fun for a day or two. Sherwood Dungeon definitely does that. It keeps you entertained because it's like a brand new thing and you're like, wow, you know, brand new stuff. Look at all these things I can do. But that's like the time limit on it. You have fun for like a day or two before you realize, oh, this is it. I guess I'll just go back to RuneScape then. So despite the fact that the game is just running on life support these days and is basically considered a relic of the past that just refuses to shut down, the people still remember it very fondly. Maybe not the gameplay itself, but maybe they just remember the experiences that they had in the game, you know, interacting with the community and just having fun. And everyone loves to talk about how the good old days and how nostalgic the game was, even if none of them really play it anymore. I think I'm also included in that category. And yeah, that's all I really want to talk about with you guys today. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.